Welcome everyone to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network April webinar. My name is Xiaohan Bao Smith. I'm your moderator today, and we will be talking about recognizing LGBTQ history experiences from the Lake Michigan Lakeshore today. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I would like to go over some Zoom tips. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please also type them into the Q&A box. And the chat box will be used to share links and resources discussed in the webinar. If you don't see those boxes, please wiggle your mouse. They should pop up at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please participate in the survey after the webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We advocate for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. If you are not a member yet, please consider joining us at mhpn.org. Our webinar series is sponsored in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you our speaker today. He is also a MHPN board member, Eric Golanek, PhD. He is the executive director of Saugatuck Douglas Historical Society. And Eric's full bio should be in the chat box if you would like to read it. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Eric. Eric, please go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thank you. 1 second. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Sohan, for that introduction and for facilitating this, this series. I'm really excited to be here and share some perspective from Lake Michigan Lakeshore. Thank you to Sohan. I want to thank our President Janet Krager as well for the invitation to present with MHPN. I'll acknowledge a number of other important people working in this area of LGBTQ history, public history, and preservation as I go along today. I wanted to start out to say that my presentation is very much grounded in my experiences over the last 6 years as director at the Saugatuck Douglas History Center, and in particular the work we did starting in 2020 on our Century of Progress 100 Years of LGBTQ History exhibition. We were really, I'll say more about the project and show you some of the things we learned and some of what we showcase in that exhibition. I wanted to speak today about a kind of case study in a sense of what recognizing LGBTQ history looks like in Saugatuck and Douglas, and hopefully some lessons and some broader context that we can think about far beyond the Lake Michigan shoreline, right? We can think about regionally, if not beyond. So let me jump in here and acknowledge that I am a strong and tireless ally for the LGBTQ community and people. And I speak humbly to share some of the stories and experiences here. And I look forward to any comments or stories you may have to share in the chat and in our discussion after the presentation. So I'll go ahead and get started here. The presentation today will really look at first giving some bigger picture of what is the communities of Saugatuck and Douglas. What are they like? What's the kind of setting for this story and some of the formative influences and themes, and then looking at this kind of shifting contexts of for recognizing underrepresented populations in history and around leading up to the year 2019 and 2020, and then share in detail some of what we've done at the History Center, and then finally some concluding thoughts about next steps, right, in goals to think about. So just a bit about the History Center at the beginning here. We are a 501c3 local history organization charged with preserving local history to inspire learning, to inform and improve our community. We manage an archive, we manage an art collection, all focused on the Lakeshore region, and also do that through two primary sites, the Douglas Union School Building, which you see on the screen right now, home of the Century of Progress exhibition that opened in 2021. You see there on the left-hand side of the screen. And the schoolhouse was built in 1867 as one of the last remaining Union school buildings in Michigan, and a beautiful example that the center was able to take an option to purchase and restore beginning in 2005. So that's our main campus. We also maintain and operate out of this beautiful site, the brick building you see in the lower left-hand side of the screen, the early 1900s municipal water pump house building just at the foot of Mount Baldhead. And in the background, you'll see that big radome golf ball there, the Saugatuck Gap Pillar Radar Annex, which we're really proud was listed on the National Register back in just a year ago. So lots of history in the community and in the landscape. For those of you from further afield have not had the fortune to visit Saugatuck, we're just south of Holland on the Lake Michigan shoreline at the mouth of the Kalamazoo River. I like to think about maps as one way to kind of find our place and to find where we are. And this is a map from our collections at the History Center, showing the old Northwest Territory in 1844. And we really begin our story thinking here about the displacement of the Odawa and Potawatomi peoples, particularly after the Treaty of Chicago in 1830. And so this is 14 years after the government forcibly removes indigenous people from what is Southwest Michigan. And it's in 1830 that some of the first migrants from New England come to what becomes Saugatuck and Douglas today. We get a sense of that. Overland connections from Marshall along the Kalamazoo River and along the river, and of course over Lake Michigan and the shoreline itself. You see the towns of Singapore and Breeze on the map. Singapore is well known to many people for the lore that's connected with it. I'll say just a couple words about that in a minute. The town of Breeze, less familiar, a paper town planned, but never developed, but near to the site of Douglas today, the two towns north and south of one another across the river. This is our iconic view of Singapore, the mill town, lumber milling town around 1870. It's established in 1837. It goes through some slow growth and hard times in the Panic of 1837. Rebounds through the misfortune of the Great Fires of Chicago and much of the upper Midwest in 1871. But by 1875, ecological disaster, shifting sands, and waning economic fortunes leads to the mills getting moved to St. Ignace. And so Singapore becomes an abandoned settlement. Many buildings there were moved, dismantled, some remained, and lots of lore connected with the site just to the north of Saugatuck on the Kalamazoo River as Michigan's Pompeii. Right? So we see a photo here, maybe from the 19-teens or 1930s, of the sands enveloping, concealing, revealing again, burying again, many structures, buildings, objects in the dunes. And this is a metaphor in some ways for thinking about this landscape of concealing and revealing, over the passage of time, which I'll hint at as we go along. Singapore today is commemorated with a Michigan State historic marker in front of City Hall, about 2 miles from the site of Singapore. It's dedicated in 1958, one of the earliest state markers in the program, telling the story of this settlement. Much of the history of Saugatuck is familiar with other lake towns along Lake Michigan, lumbering, giving way to shipbuilding and wooden age industries, an emphasis on fruit growing and agriculture by the later 19th century, intensification, the building and growth of cities and towns and institutions. But Saugatuck really becomes a standout around 1900 as a tourist destination, as an entertainment destination, and as an artist destination. So certainly fruit growing is a big part of that. Agritourism is nothing new in the 21st century. And so people are traveling to stay at farms and orchards in the early 1900s, much as we're still drawn to these places today. And they were able to do it through the efficiency of steam power, of the railroad, and of steamships, which we get some sense here in its connection to fruit growing and the fruit trade, but also to the movement of people. By the early 1900s, large-scale entertainment venues like Saugatuck's Big Pavilion open, one of the first places in the area to have electric lighting, becomes known as the brightest spot on the lake, and becomes a destination for tourists, particularly from Chicago, but from other lakeshore cities, Milwaukee, of South Haven, of Holland. And I included this photo here just to give you a sense of whether round trippers, day trippers, or people coming for longer stays than that one-day excursion, literally coming off of Great Lakes steamships and filing into the dance hall here, right, into this entertainment space, which is an iconic fixture until it burns in May of 1960. I mentioned artists and the significance of the arts in Saugatuck. Many may be familiar with the Saugatuck Center for the Arts Theater complex, or maybe the history of Oxbow School of Art and Artist Residency. Oxbow, located, we'll see in just a moment, on the west side of Mount Baldhead, the big dune we saw, is first established in 1910 and begins operating on its current site in 1914. This is one of the founders, Frederick Ferry Fersman, of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and a painting in the History Center collection signed and dated to 1914, the same year as this photo. And you get a sense of the importance of the landscape, of being out in nature, of being away from the noise and pollution and distraction of the metropolis in the 19 teens. And here, working in this post-impressionist plein air style, we get a view into the past and a sense of history, and we might say a kind of adaptive reuse. This is the current home of the Oxbow School of Art still today, but it is a 1860s fish town and hotel immediately at the entrance of the old mouth of the Kalamazoo River. This painting was done in 1914 and gives you a sense of this, of the setting here, just after it becomes landlocked. The river changes course through a Corps of Engineers channel that's dredged in 1906, and this becomes a literal backwater. And that's to the benefit of the artists who are able to rent this site and eventually purchase the property. And it now operates as the oldest continuously running art colony in the United States. Artists are incredibly important to the story. Tourists are important to the story. And Saugatuck, by 1930, is really seeing itself as having a history of having a lot to offer visitors to attract people traveling along the West Michigan Pike, which runs through Saugatuck, or coming by steamship into the city. And this is a view here commemorating the centennial of Saugatuck's founding in 1830. This was done in 1930 by Chicago illustrator Fred Stearns, and gives us this kind of whimsical, sensuous, as he describes it, an intimate map of Saugatuck around 1930. You can see the big pavilion in the kind of center left of the view, the Riverside Hotel, immediately to the west of Mount Baldhead there, and the formation of this lagoon. I could say a lot more about the cultural landscape of Saugatuck, but I really want to kind of move into really thinking about the kind of LGBTQ context and how it intersects with some of what I've just shared with you. Lots of the themes of this embrace of nature, of a capital R romanticism and romantic sentiment along the lakeshore in the 1930s is evident in the work of Carl Herman that we see here, this topographic view of Saugatuck and of the dunes, and is replicated, 70 years later in postcard views like this one. Also worth acknowledging for our audience here today that this view looking from Mount Baldhead to the north gives us a view of the lagoon in the middle ground, and off in the distance, we're seeing that kind of North Shore development area at the river mouth of the Kalamazoo. I include these just to kind of set the scene and to give us some color on a gray day here in West Michigan, but also to call attention to, we've talked about artists, we've talked about nature, and we can also think of the importance of those dunes and water as such an important draw for visitors coming to Saugatuck by the 1930s and beyond. Prior to 1936, to go to the beach, you would have taken a boat down the Kalamazoo River, out to the lakeshore or to the bathing beach, a cove along the Kalamazoo River, or climbed over the dunes. After 1936, Perryman Road and Oval Beach is built as a WPA project. That's the view we see here in the upper left of this scene here. And for the first time, people are able to easily drive by car to Lake Michigan from Saugatuck, right? Crossing over those dunes and traveling in there. And, Oval Beach is just a huge part of the community's history and its appeal as a destination today. The view in the lower right gives you a sense of some of the changes due to beach erosion and the shifting sands of those great dunes as the parking lot has been moved and replaced a number of times over. The original oval is long gone that you see in the upper left. But the overall form of parking in this elliptical series of parking lots remains in modern form. You can also see in that photo in the lower right, I mentioned the old Kalamazoo River and the formation of that lagoon. You're seeing the water in the background of the photo in the lower right, the original course of the Kalamazoo River. And if you're there today, it's completely enclosed with sand, filled with sand, creating this lagoon feature. All right. Off in the distance is Oxbow School of Art. We were to go along that lagoon inland. All right. So in thinking about Saugatuck, it's a community that has a long history and association as a home for all with a significant LGBTQ population. As a historian and as our board and volunteers working at the History Center came to think about this, I was like, how do we tell the story? How do we access and pin down some of the details of how this happened? Why did Saugatuck become a haven for LGBTQ plus people? And we identified a few questions to think about and to dig deeper. What was it like to identify as queer in the early and mid 20th century? What is the story of equality and human rights for LGBTQ people in the community? What social and economic progress has the local gay and lesbian community made over the last century or not? And then also, who are the prominent and maybe not so prominent gay and lesbian individuals who made an impact on the local community? So thinking about those questions, we had some background to start with, some material to start with. And some of this goes back to the early 2000s. In 2006, Dr. Jim Schmeeken, some of you may know Jim, professor emeritus in history from Central Michigan University, longtime activist and engaged Lakeshore historian, among many accomplishments. Jim was key in creating what was termed then the Saugatuck Gay History Project, or GLBT History Project. And the idea here was really to go out into the community and begin doing oral history interviews, collecting photographs, collecting other potential archival materials, and gathering those for the future, right? So 2006, innovative project that gets started. And in 2009, the History Center's Summertime, A History of Leisure at the Lake Michigan Shoreline exhibition includes one of its panels, one of its areas in the exhibition focused on gay history, right? And this is really in 2009, the first effort to sort of collect and synthesize what's known about, I'll just say, the early history of gay people in Saugatuck and Douglas, right? And certainly groundbreaking, one of the first exhibitions in Michigan, certainly at a historical society to kind of engage with these stories in the 2000s. After that, there's some time that passes and some questions about, is this accessible? What can we know? What can we find out about the experiences of queer people at the Lakeshore beyond what's already been said, you know? And there were a number of factors that led to the deeper dive into this topic. I'll say more about those in a moment. But from summertime in 2009, there's a commitment at the History Center to do a larger project and a larger public exhibition that will look at the history of the region through an LGBTQ experience, right? And so this begins in 2019, and the intention is we'll open this exhibition in the summer, June, Pride Month 2020. And we all know what happened next, right? So this exhibition was delayed, this project was delayed, which silver linings, if you know, such as they can sometimes appear, the additional time really allowed us to do and gather a lot more feedback and a lot more stories, and put this timeline exhibition together. So I'll say more about that process, but I want to highlight some things that we learned and their significance as it relates to Saugatuck and this sense of recognizing LGBTQ history. So beginning in the 2000s, as Dr. Jim Schmeeken and others began asking questions and doing research, this was discovered pretty early on. And this is, you know, the question of, when does the Saugatuck story begin? What are the origins of, let's just say, LGBTQ people at the Lakeshore? And you know, it's a challenging question, because we know that the origins are, you know, the beginning of human occupation, right? We've always had queer people. The definitions of those terms and the expression and understanding of those are contextual. But for our purposes, when does this story begin? When is there some written evidence that we can point to and say, there's something interesting here that we can start to interpret, perhaps directly or perhaps in a more oblique way? So this story appears in the local newspaper, one of the oldest continuous newspapers in Michigan, the Saugatuck's Commercial Record, then the Lakeshore Commercial masthead. And on July 2nd, 1897, in the dense front page of Local Matter is this story that describes at last, a bathing house on the lake beach is to be an assured fact. This week, A.L. Weed began the construction of a building on the lake beach west of Mount Baldhead, 18 by 36 feet in size, which will have 12 dressing rooms, and an office 6 by 12 feet in size. The boat line that's, as you see in the photo in the lower right, ferried people from Saugatuck down the Kalamazoo River to the beach. This is before the road is built. The boat line will be the owner and will place an attendant in charge. Such an institution has come to be a necessity, and vigorous steps should be at once taken by the village board to put a stop to men and boys bathing in a nude condition on the beach adjacent to the park lands. So this is interesting in its own right, and certainly fits within a context of the vigorous life of the late 19th century and this embrace of physique and physical fitness and vigorous activity, strenuous activity in the outdoors, but placed within the context of what's happening around 1900 in Saugatuck. As we'll see, there's some sort of deep history here that we're getting a sense of, this reference to men bathing in a nude condition on the beach in this area just to the north of Oval Beach, to the west of Mount Baldhead. There's something interesting sort of in this story from the turn of the century. I included a couple of photos. We see this photo of the what's here described as the old bathhouse in Saugatuck, but this is what's described in 1898 in the newspaper. And we get a sense of bathers here at the beach, very much clothed in the photos that I'm showing you right now, but traveling to the beach in canoes, in small boats, as well as taking those ferries from the boat company to travel out here long before Oval Beach is created, right? Almost 35 years before Oval Beach is a reality that people are traveling to this area. By the 1950s, Oval Beach is we're in the post-war era. We're in the baby boomer generation here in full swing, and Saugatuck becomes a destination, particularly for college students, for people in their teens and 20s, coming out by the carload, right, and coming out to Oval Beach and having a really good time, right? Saugatuck becomes a party destination for young people in this era. This is Oval Beach, owned by the city, built by the WPA in the 1930s, and all the amenities connected with it. The area immediately to the north of Oval Beach, which is today the Saugatuck Natural Area, preserved as open space, natural space. In the 1970s, certainly, and 1980s, this was known as the private beach. And this was an area that was it was legally separate from Oval Beach and became a destination, particularly for gay men, but for people of all backgrounds, where nudism was widely practiced, where there was lots of parties and good times happening there, and really becomes an iconic aspect to the Lakeshore community at Saugatuck and Douglas, certainly by the 1970s and 1980s. I've included a handful of photographs we have taken by people having a good time at the private beach in the 1970s and 1980s. I've also included a promotional poster from the Douglas Dunes Resort. The Dunes Resort opens in 1981. We'll say more about the dunes in just a moment. But it's no coincidence to me that the kind of sensuous lines of the dunescape and of the beach sort of mirror the masculine body reclined in the foreground of the image there, right? And so the dunes and the beach are sort of synonymous with a good time and a particular kind of queer space, certainly by the 1970s and 1980s. Based on oral histories, it seems that people were coming to the beaches long before the 1970s and 1980s. And by that, I mean the private beach. And it requires some further research and investigation to confirm. But that 1897 reference to nude bathing, it's entirely possible this is a continuous activity or intermittent activity within this space, which makes it certainly notable as a queer space at the Lakeshore and as a destination, as we'll see more in a moment. This gives you a sense of the private beach, how this was administered. You paid admission to walk in from Oval Beach or from the trails from Mount Baldhead across the dunes. And you see here it says public nudity will result in your arrest. And there was certainly, by all accounts that I've heard, lots of nudism practice in this area. The reference here is that you were not allowed to be on the beach. You're not allowed to be in the space. You could be surveilled from the edge of the private beach or along the shoreline, the public right of way. So I paint this picture here to really try to give a sense of the layered landscape that has these layers of significance to it. In the maybe as early as the late 19th century, but certainly by the second half of the 20th century. And its important role in making Saugatuck, as it's described as, the Fire Island of the Midwest, right? And Saugatuck, I'm using Saugatuck and Douglas somewhat interchangeably here. But by the fall of 1981, the Douglas Dunes Resort is truly a regional destination that is widely known, both certainly within the queer community, but much more publicly, much more broadly through the 1980s, and is still in continuous operation today at its original site. We'll see more of that in just a moment. But this is a good point I think, to set the stage and to give a sense of some of how do we know these stories? How do we access these stories? Carl Jennings and his husband, Larry Gammons, founded the Douglas Dunes Resort in 1981. They were married for over 50 years together. And it was really Carl's passing in the winter of 2019 that was one really formative influence on people in our community and at the History Center to say, we need to capture the stories and share the stories and history of some of our community trailblazers. Both Carl and Larry Larry is still with us and still very active in the community and with the History Center as well. But both Carl and Larry were prominent business owners. They were involved in a great deal of charity work within Saugatuck and within the county and region, and really put Douglas on the map as a destination from the 1980s and beyond. So we were fortunate to be able to conduct some detailed oral history interviews with Carl and with Larry and learn quite a bit about their stories back in 2018, working together with Grand Valley State University and the Cucci Office of Local History. The Stories of Summer project produced about 40 hours of oral history interviews and also digitized a vast collection of material, some of it already in our archives, a great deal of it donated or loaned to us to be able to put into collections. And a great example of a kind of grassroots history harvest in action. I became involved with the project as I joined the History Center in 2018. But everyone you see here in this photo are volunteers that help conduct the interviews and help run the history harvest itself. So a great kind of populist history project that yielded some fascinating information and also filled out and raised some questions for us of thinking about things we already knew. So I'll talk more. We'll talk a little bit about this business, an historic site, the Blue Tempo Bar and House of Music, which opened in February 1960 and eventually closed in 1975 and was destroyed likely by arson in 1976. The Blue Tempo is notable for a number of reasons. Connecting to our story so far, Carl Jennings was a bartender here at the Blue Tempo in 1960. So he had a long history of coming to Saugatuck for work in the summer and working here. And it's really 20 years later, right, that the Douglas Dunes is established, in part based on the experience and some of the reputation that the Blue Tempo had garnered in those intervening years. It's a jazz club. I mentioned entertainment as a major theme and attraction that differentiates Saugatuck from some other communities along the lakeshore. Saugatuck is host to uh, two notable jazz festivals in 1959 and 1960. I guess three, 1961 as well. The 1959 festival is actually held in the big pavilion we saw photos of earlier. Always amazing to think about what it would have been like to have seen, Dizzy Gillespie in that big pavilion, right, in that great dance hall in 1959. It was successful enough, they did it again, but the building burned down in May of 1960. So they moved it off site, and it just wasn't quite the same again. But, Dave Brubeck, Duke Ellington, right, are playing in Saugatuck. And in terms of thinking of context, right, this is the same musical moment, right, cultural moment that the Newport Jazz Festival is founded, right, is just getting underway. So in the what if category of history, if that pavilion hadn't burned, could Saugatuck have become the Newport of the Midwest? Possibly, hard to say. But Michigan's biggest swing this weekend certainly appealed to younger crowds looking for a good time and all of the wildness of jazz, right, in the 1950s and 1960s. And by all accounts, the Blue Tempo was really established out of this love for jazz and having a live music venue in Saugatuck where the cool cats can hang out. But it fairly quickly, within a few years of opening, if not immediately, is attracting gay and straight mixed audiences, right? It becomes known as a place where gay clients, gay patrons can come and are treated, or at least accepted, aren't turned away, right? Aren't harassed while they're there. How do we know that? We know that from oral history. We also know that from the appearance of this book and the appearance of this site in Bob Dameron's address book in 1965, the second edition of the Dameron address book. And for those of you, some of you may be familiar with the Dameron Guide. It's established in the 1960s. It's a publication that this man, Bob Dameron, puts out of safe, welcoming venues or places across the country. Somewhat analogous to the Green Book for African American travelers, but focused initially for gay men, but for queer people more generally. And this is the entry for Saugatuck that you see on your screen right now. Saugatuck, summer resort near Holland, Michigan. Blue Tempo Bar, mixed, M for mixed, so gay and straight patrons. In parentheses, an interesting beach nearby. And then also a listing for the Elms Hotel, which was a boarding house that did accommodate gay lodgers in the 1960s. Lots to say about Bob Dameron. And if you're not familiar with this, one thing I hope you'll take away from this program today is to go read more, to go explore further. Dr. Eric Gonzava and Dr. Amanda Regan have put together a fascinating digital humanities project, which is online, which is totally free, where you can search. They have mapped locations from the Dameron guides from 1965 until I think 1980, 85. And you can search the map. You can sort and filter on the map and be able to read these entries. And some of them have had some supplemental information added to them as well. It's an ongoing project. I think they started in maybe 2018 or 2019. Absolutely fascinating way to look at the landscape and access sites that are actively described as queer spaces or places in that historical moment. And it's great fodder for further research or further survey to go and identify some of these places. So I share this because there's a real world example, right? The Blue Tempo Jazz Club. Here it is listed as somewhere that is welcoming of mixed audiences in a known place for travelers to find a friend, as Bob Dameron described it at the time. What's significant about this? Well, in the 1960s, through much of the 20th century, but certainly by the 1950s, in the Lavender Scare period, open discrimination against LGBTQ people. It's illegal for bars to serve uh, minors, intoxicated persons, or as the Liquor Control Ordinance describes, state law describes, bars are prohibited from admitting, quote, prostitutes, homosexuals, or vagrants, right? And the penalty for that could be getting raided, right? Having your liquor license taken away, being fined, being shut down. So interesting that the Blue Tempo continues to operate for about 15 years. Does not appear to be police harassment during this time period. It's an unknown question as to why that is. Many possible explanations for that. But the Dameron Guide is significant because many places, including in Saugatuck, were not welcoming, were openly hostile to gay patrons coming in to drink, coming in to spend time there. Right. So I want to talk a little bit about what changes in our thinking about LGBTQ history, public history preservation. One important change that happens is happening locally and also happening nationally. And I mentioned to you when, the Century of Progress exhibition really comes out of Carl Jennings' death in the winter of 2019 and a community call to collect stories and to celebrate and share the stories of trailblazing people from our community. At a national level, there's big changes happening as well, right? And so the Stonewall Inn is a national monument, declared a national monument in 2016. President Obama travels to Greenwich Village and sort of cuts the ribbon on that designation there. But there's really a call starting in 2014 within the National Park Service that there should be an initiative to recognize LGBTQ plus sites on the register and in the Park Service system. At the time, out of over 1 million National Register sites, only 5 could be identified as LGBTQ related. Okay. So importance of leadership in context, changing context is very important. In 2016, the Department of the Interior puts out this theme study, and you see a list of some of these themes. If you're interested in exploring some potential for further research and survey, documentation, recognition, this is certainly a great place to start, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but it gives you a sense of some of the categories of themes to think about here, and some of which we've touched on already and are touched on in the exhibition. Dr. Tim Retzloff, who has done some just marvelous work in the state on the history of LGBTQ sites and commemoration. His blog from 2017 and the entire site really is just a wealth of information and resources and food for thought. But I highlighted this because this is in 2017. This is 2 years before the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion and a flurry of activity we'll see in just a moment to commemorate that. But here's really this important acknowledgement that of one strategy for thinking about this work, which is, identifying people, unrecognized sites or unrecognized people. The other is of sort of thinking about uh, the sort of multiple layers of significance. And here there's a mention, right, reference to Palmer Park in Indian Village, Boston Edison, and Detroit. And as Dr. Retzloff writes, these areas are remembered for their architectural gems or because auto barons lived there. Their gay history, however, is not part of that recognition, at least not yet, right? And so there's opportunities all around us as we think about the sort of shifting lens of significance to be able to go and look at some of our landscapes, some of our treasured buildings and sites, and say, is there a significance here? Is there a special contribution to by or for LGBTQ people in this story? Our work at the center, sort of came out of some of this context very indirectly, but really able to work with Grand Valley and the Cucci office. We were able to put some of this story on display in 2018. And as I've mentioned already, 2019, we really begin this deeper, broader look at LGBTQ history to put an exhibition together. What's influencing that? Lots of projects going on around the country, particularly in New York and on the East Coast and West Coast. But New York Public Library has their Love and Resistance Stonewall at 50 exhibition, highlighting the ephemera, publications, posters, graphic design, creative works made before and after Stonewall, before and after 1969. The Smithsonian is also, had been actively collecting, but is sort of called to put put exhibitions together. And this was inspiring for us at the History Center because we realized, hey, we have some parallel stories to tell, right? We have some parallel artifacts and ephemera. We can do this, right? This is an important, relevant story to tell. Saugatuck Douglas celebrates its first ever community pride in 2019, which is surprising to many people in the community and outside of it. And the reasons, and it's kind of food for thought to think more deeply about that, why that is. But this 50-year threshold of Stonewall, the Stonewall Inn and the Stonewall Rebellion is really significant, far beyond Greenwich Village. So first community pride in Douglas in 2019, efforts underway, momentum building for the Century of Progress exhibition. So I'm not going to take you through this panel by any means, but I just want to highlight a couple of details from the exhibition that might be of interest to you. We're incredibly proud of the exhibition. We were recognized by the Michigan Museum Association with their Peninsulas Prize in 2021, which was a great honor for us as a small historical society. Feel like we're punching above our weight class often. But the exhibition really starts in looking at what are some of these contributing factors happening in Saugatuck, some of which we've touched on, and then state, national context alongside that. So what's happening at the state level or regional level? And really, a story picks up in the 1920s. I want to highlight the story of Florence Danny Hunn because it's such a great, she was such a fascinating person and artist. She's living from the 1880s into the 1980s when she passes away. And her connection to Saugatuck is Superior Cove, which is just to the south, in the fruit belt, just to the south of Saugatuck, immediately south there. And she's notable as a recognized interior designer working in Chicago and New York in the 19-teens and through the 1950s and 60s. But she also has a lifelong companion named Mabel Jims Warren, and they purchase a Lakeshore cottage together around 1917 and are together for about half a century. This is a portrait from our collection of Florence Hunn, J. Wellington Reynolds. This is some of Han's work, as well as another portrait of her as a young woman in Berlin in 1910. She's particularly known for colonial revival interior design work, and it appears that she had ambition to be an architect and was greatly limited by her gender and perhaps by her sexual uh, or identity as well in the 19 teens and beyond. Another photo of Florence, sometimes went by Danny, as Danny Hun, or from the 1920s or 30s, and one of her surviving buildings that she did design as a cottage for some Chicagoans in Saugatuck on the Kalamazoo River in 1927. Not very colonial revival at all. Certainly a kind of arts and crafts modern feel to the building overall, using terracotta bricks from the Kalamazoo Brick Company and really relying on the sort of modern expression of materiality in the building, inside and out. So here's a just stunning view. No plaster on the interior walls of the building. This is just a very quick snapshot of some of the people featured in the exhibition for the sake of time. But Han is, just a tremendously fascinating story for anyone that cares about history of design or history of architecture. And, her identity as a queer person is certainly an important contributing element to that. Foreman Brown is featured in our exhibition. He's known as the author of Better Angels. He wrote under a pseudonym in 1933 and is celebrated as one of the first American novels to have a sort of sympathetic or, say, self-aware, healthy view of queerness, of gayness in the 1930s. He's also a puppeteer and theater artist, and goes on to achieve quite a bit of fame in Los Angeles. But from Otsego, Michigan, attends the University of Michigan, an important figure to acknowledge. Lots of history of puppetry in Saugatuck, for reasons I won't have time to go into. But Bert Tillstrom may be a name familiar to many of you. If not the name, his work, his puppets may be familiar to you. Kukla and Ali were his creation. He grows up in Chicago, comes to Saugatuck, to Oxbow School of Art in 1943, and continues to come back to Saugatuck for the rest of his life, and dies in Saugatuck in 1985. But not known, was not open about his sexuality in any way in his lifetime. Was very private. Did have a long-term partner in his life, but was a very private person, in part as he spoke about it to some close friends out of necessity. Working as a children's television star in the 1940s through the 1970s. This would have been sort of death to his career if there had been any indication of his personal life. Some sites connected with Burr: his home, his summer home, and the old barn on Spear Street, Saugatuck, and the Red Barn Theater, where he sometimes performed out west of northeast, I'm sorry, of Saugatuck. There's a number of sites, some of which were well known, like the Blue Tempo, and some of which less so, that came to light through oral histories and other accounts of visitors coming to Saugatuck. The Shady Shore Motel on Lake Street still operates as an inn, and was known by some as the name Lucille's Lodge for Lonesome Ladies in the 1950s. And so a notable queer site for sure. We don't know a lot about, but certainly references to this as a friendly lodging, particularly for women in this time. And the Log Cabin Tavern, an establishment that certainly by the 1930s or 1940s was known in the community as a place where gay patrons came together, right? Came and hung out. For the sake of time, I'll skip over the story. It was not a particularly welcoming institution by the community, but it persevered and remained a place that was vibrant during that time. I want to conclude, just say a couple of things about the Douglas Dunes and maybe some preservation questions or challenges to deal with. Carl and Larry established the Douglas Dunes. This is the third site that they attempt to purchase. They're initially shut out of purchasing, discriminated against, and shut out of purchasing hotel property, motel property in Saugatuck. And so they end up in Douglas and purchasing this motel from the 1960s, the Amity Motel, that comes with a liquor license. The city approves the transfer of the liquor license to them, and they're in business. So the Douglas Dunes opens in the fall of 1981. The core of this building still remains as the Dunes Resort Complex, though the modern resort looks very different. It was very different and much expanded from the original first period roadside architecture. Quickly, the Douglas Dunes becomes, through marketing and through a kind of defiant openness of LGBTQ expression at post-Stonewall in the 1970s and into the 1980s, becomes known regionally as a destination. You see some suggestion of that here. In part, it's based on the hospitality that's provided at the resort and entertainment. They had a parade of notable entertainers coming through, and disco weekly at the resort. We see the Weather Girls here performed their hit "It's Raining Men" in the 1980s at the Dunes Resort. And they also had a really successful restaurant, the Cafe Sir Douglas, which Carl and Larry ran, which attracted, again, not just gay, but also straight clientele from the area. As many people described it, one of the best restaurants around in the Lakeshore. And so people came there who weren't just staying at the resort, who weren't just there for a good time. Eartha Kitt performing at the Dunes Resort as well. And we see all kinds of contests and competitions taking place there. As you can see, it becomes a really important destination, particularly in the summertime, but really year-round from the 1980s onward. And this gives you a sense of the scale of the resort today, with the grandeur of it. Here in a photo from 2019, some of the expansion that's taken place on the site there. Right. So I'm mindful of the time. I do want to conclude here. I'll just say a couple of things about kind of next steps and in the recent past. One thing, Century of Progress was very much a celebratory exhibition in 2021, and we were really able to acknowledge, the success of the Obergefell decision and marriage equality, the importance of Michigan in that story, of openly gay, transgender, lesbian representatives at the national and state levels, and our kind of local sort of political and social leaders in the community very much celebrated in the exhibition here. And I mentioned Dr. Jim Schmeeken earlier. Here's a photograph of Jim at the exhibition. He was really pleased to see decades of work that came together. Sally Winters, one of our key volunteers and graphic designer that did the design work for this and many other exhibitions. So I wanted to show some support for them here and for our community members that came out for the support. I was pleased as a point of conclusion of looking at the preservation plan and indeed seeing the sort of focus on underrepresented populations. And I think there's a real opportunity and, to build upon the successes, to celebrate the successes we've had, and to look for opportunities to recognize LGBTQ trailblazers in Michigan, contextualizing historical places to make people, themes, and stories visible, and to support grassroots organizing and institutions to discover, preserve, share, and celebrate this history. So lots of wonderful things happening, and happy to share our experiences at the Lakeshore. And I know I'm leaving out so much of this story, and so many great things that are happening. I was pleased just to see even in the last month or so, you know, monuments and historical markers approved in Ann Arbor to acknowledge some of the earliest openly gay uh, people in government roles in the country, right in Ann Arbor. So those are all good things to celebrate. And again, Dr. Tim Retzloff doing important work here too. We reference his blog. If you haven't had a chance to look at this, this is a great example to a commemoration of Detroit 72, the first community pride in Detroit that happens in June of 1972. And they produced a graphic novel thanks to the support of Michigan Humanities. And Isabel Claire Paul, the young illustrator, young artist you see with Dr. Retzloff, put this together, relying on primary sources, oral history interviews, and newspaper quotes. Tell the story of that community pride and the activism that was behind that. So carry that message forward. I look forward to continued discussion around all of this, and thank you for your attention and patience as we went through a pretty fast tour of history at the Lakeshore. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was great. And we do have quite a few questions. And so everybody feel free to stick around. But if you have to jump off, just remember this webinar is being recorded. So you will be able to review the recording when it is available. So we will go ahead and start with some of our questions. Okay, first
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Was there any history of violence found in your research in the Saugatuck area?
Yes, definitely. Excellent question. And yes, for sure. The Century of Progress title of the exhibition was, the starting point for this. And I was, myself and others were felt it was important to also acknowledge some of the moments of resistance, of harassment, of violence, of of backsliding, as we termed it at one point, of this sense of progress of two steps forward, but one back in some case. And so there was open discrimination in Saugatuck. I mentioned the Blue Tempo as a place that the Dameron Guide says this is somewhere that gay people, mixed crowds can go. There was lots of stories of other businesses in Saugatuck that in the 1970s and 80s and after were, you know, a gay patron would go into a bar, order a drink, and they'd pour the drink and pour it out on the bar and tell them to get out, you know. And other examples of graffiti, of smashed windows, of violence. There was a bomb threat at the Douglas Dunes in the 1980s. There was a fire, mysterious fire that had happened at the Dunes Resort. So there was certainly harassment and violence that was directed towards queer people in the community, for sure. Yeah.
Mhm. And following that question, the audience also asked, why was it the law enforcement allowed gay establishments to serve during the time of Michigan's open discrimination of the LGBTQ? Were there political connections?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, don't have an answer for that question. Um, I mean, some possible explanations are that there was a perception that business was good. This was good for Saugatuck. That Saugatuck had a reputation as being a bit of an open town. I mentioned the kind of youth invasion of young people coming to the beach and just partying at Oval Beach, not at the private beach, but just coming to drink beers and hang out and meet people and be on boats and be at the beach. And so I think there was a certain sense of that, of this was a place that saw itself as it had a tolerance for exuberant, celebratory, wild times. But it's unclear why there appeared to be more tolerance or restraint than in some other communities. It is possible that there were There may have been some corruption involved. I mean, I don't have evidence to point to that, but we certainly know that lots of gay bars and establishments were protected by or harassed by, depending on how you want to say it, by organized crime elements that ensured they could stay open. And I have no evidence to say that's true in Saugatuck, but that's certainly one possible explanation as well of how is this seem to be a fairly tension-free place, where other places are, routinely being shook down, or there's police brutality directed towards LGBTQ people in this era.
Thank you. Okay, next question. There are beautiful historic churches in Saugatuck and Douglas. How did the religious communities interface with the LGBTQ residents and visitors?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, um, again, great topic for further research. If someone has a master's student or a personal interest and wants to do some more research on the history of churches in Saugatuck, that would be awesome. The social history of religion in Saugatuck. Um, so, one answer to that would be, a level of acceptance of being opening and affirming, is insofar as it would be understood in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. Douglas United Church of Christ is open and affirming congregation today, in one of several churches, including All Saints Episcopal, Congregational Church in Saugatuck, that has had LGBTQ uh, pastors or religious leaders. Um, one prominent private one prominent figure with Douglas UCC in the 1950s is gay herself, and so that's an important part of the story, I think, but it's unclear to what extent that was acknowledged by the church or how that was accommodated by the church. uh, to answer the question, I think there was a sense of affirming liberal religious sentiment within some of the churches. Uh, but this is also an era, right, where there's a high level of privacy and guardedness by many people, that may be concealing that side of their self expression of self.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Could you please talk about the archival resources held by your organization? Are those records accessible online?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you so much. So I did include here in the our website, mysdhistory.org. We are very proud to have a new website in the last year, and if you visit the website under our historical materials, we have our growing online collection, which is quite expansive at this point, and you can view that directly from the website and see images and see descriptions of some of the materials that we have, as well as searching the collection. So there's quite a bit of material that is available online, that has been photographed or cataloged and made available online. I would say if you have further questions, please reach out to me, and I can try to answer questions about specific resources we have. Um, yeah, great question. Thank you for that. It's giving me a chance to make that plug.
Okay, next question. The exhibit was wonderful, and are there any parts of it traveling to other venues?
Another great question. Thank you. We would love to travel the exhibition. It's been really popular at the center. We had, in fact, initially planned to take the exhibition down, and we've kept it in place, in part because of the nature of tourism. We get a lot of new visitors that come into the community, and they're interested to learn that story. Frankly, as well, the exhibit feels even more relevant in 2024 than it did in 21, as far as the climate for um, attitudes and climate towards queer people in the country. And so we would love the opportunity to share this story more broadly, and could certainly talk about. I'd love to talk about with anyone that has ideas of where we might take this story, take this exhibition.
Okay, next question. In all ways, Saugatuck and Douglas seemed willing to support their cultural activities. When did that start? To what do you attribute that support?
Yeah, that's an excellent. Lots of good questions here. This is a. And I'm not surprised. Smart audience. So thank you. I think there does seem to be a deep and rich history of philanthropy and social association. You know, it struck me. Uh, I'm new to the community and new to working in the community, but its history, past and present, feels like something, you know, in a very much Tocquevillian model, right? People come together, they want to do projects, they want to support public art projects, they want to create a history organization, they want to save buildings, and I don't know exactly what that relates to. I think, you know, one thing that to circle back to the beginning of the presentation today, uh, it's an area that for at least the last 100 years and maybe much longer has attracted people that have a, you know, a kind of romantic spirit and are looking to connect with nature and are looking to think, to connect with themselves and express themselves, whether that's in the visual arts of painting or drawing, printmaking, whether that's in theater, whether that's in music. And so I think that encourages a certain degree of support and a desire to connect with others and do bigger things. So I think that's part of it there that I would point to.
Okay. Okay, next question. What role does the Oxbow School of Art played in the life of Saugatuck and Douglas?
Yeah, yeah. So the Oxbow School of Art really begins in 1910. And all acknowledgement to our friends at Oxbow that you know we work closely with, we've worked with on projects and exhibitions in as well. So I don't want to take ownership of their story. We should invite them to talk about Oxbow sometime. But Oxbow certainly has a huge influence on the community of bringing not just the artists that directly studied at the Summer School of Painting or were teachers at the Summer School of Painting from the 1910s and beyond, uh, but the dozens, hundreds of artists, thousands of artists over the last 115 years that have come to Saugatuck either because they've heard of this place or they've known someone that came here before and continue to create. And it's, you know, it gives a sense of sort of artistic creation and an embrace of the arts that's almost in the DNA of the community. Uh, the school has had close relationships with the town and community activities since its founding. So it's a huge influence. It's also an artist colony unto itself. It's a place for artists to go and get away and do experimental work. So it can also be a private place that exists. Its reason for being at core is a place for artists to connect and commune with nature and with each other, and to leave, you know, leave community, leave the outer world behind. So it's a source of incubation of ideas and creativity and energy, and also a place unto itself.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Would you be able to set a period of significance for LGBTQ in Saugatuck? Any potential for establishing new local historic districts?
Yeah, that's a great question. More research needed. Yeah, I think the one challenge that to think about is um, the the survival of resources, or the degree to which how we define, how we evaluate integrity in some of these places. And in some ways I think it, you know, it's almost a, a cultural landscape, you know. um, but in terms of that period of significance, I think to put myself out there, just to say, share a reaction. I think that from 1960 to the present, there would be some intermediate periods within there to talk about, but certainly some really significant things happening within that time period, um, immediately before and after Stonewall, that are important to acknowledge. The period from the 1990s to the through the 2000s is also really important one. I didn't talk about this at all for sake of time, but in terms of the civil rights uh, activism and challenges within Saugatuck and Douglas, the reluctance to pass civil rights ordinances in Saugatuck in the 1990s, some notable cases of discrimination in the 1980s and 1990s in Saugatuck that were contentious and are stories that we shouldn't shy away from, right? We should learn from. So, yeah, need more research, need more time to think about that question. Good question.
Thank you. Next question. Could you say more about the fresh air movement and the people and campers that it brought to Saugatuck?
Right. Yeah. That's a key theme, a key story to follow in the early history from that I talked about today, that history from around the turn of the century. There's a number of things happening, before cottagers come and build bungalows and along the Kalamazoo River or along Lakeshore Drive. People are coming to camp, and the city actually establishes Mount Baldhead as a park uh, around the dune for campers in the late 19th century. So there's this history of camping that's really significant and predates the West Michigan Pike, but it certainly sort of feeds into the sort of early automobile tourism that comes, around just after the turn of the century. The other development I did not talk about directly at all are the religious camps that are established in Saugatuck, and so uh, settlement directly influenced by settlement house movement in Chicago. Presbyterian uh, church establishes a summer camp for uh, youth and families, particularly for, we'd say ethnic and racial minorities, for uh, economically disadvantaged young people and families to come to Saugatuck and to stay at Camp Gray or Presbyterian Camp, starting in the early, at the turn of the century. And that operates well into the 1990s. So that's a really significant uh, historical event, historical happening for Saugatuck in its own right. It's also, I think, very influential on uh, the sense of the diversity of people that are coming to Saugatuck through those programs and through those camps, and may make it a somewhat more progressive, more free-thinking place because of that influence.
Mhm. Okay. Next question. Being so close to Chicago, it could have been so easy for Saugatuck and Douglas to turn into a playground for the rich, but it did not seem to be happen. Do you have any thoughts on why it didn't?
I don't. I'll share my reaction to that question. I think historically, I think in the 20th century, um, the community um, was suffered a kind of uh, yeah, I think some of its economic fortunes made it a place that bohemian people could move there, and it could sort of accommodate a more bohemian lifestyle. So I think that why that is, I think the geography of the immediate area is kind of complicated, and so there's not there's other there's other places that, could be developed more easily. I'm not sure. It'd be an interesting case study to look at some other communities that do become much more developed by and controlled by more affluent uh, developers, property owners. My sense is that the village character of Saugatuck and Douglas survives um, just out of, a kind of a, it becomes a, it's sort of off the beaten path, and it becomes a haven for people that continue to occupy and live and bring vibrancy to the community, but don't bring a lot of direct investment that radically changes the community.
Mm.
I don't know why that is. I don't have a good answer for why that didn't happen, but it certainly made it certainly an interesting place because of its history.
Mhm. Okay, next question. Was the LGBTQ community always welcomed by the city administration, or were there moments when that was not the case?
Right. Yeah. Um, I don't have a dramatic example of hostility or open discrimination that I would point to by local government. Um, I do think that the reluctance to there were moments of discrimination and reluctance to accept gay people in the communities. I made reference to uh, Carl and Larry and the Douglas founding the Douglas Dunes, and uh, the city needed to approve the sale of the property and really the transfer of their liquor license, as I understand it, in 1980. And in more than one case, more than one property, the city declined to approve that transfer, to approve that license. And um, it seems obvious the reason why was because they did not want a gay owned business that was catering to gay clientele, gay patrons in Saugatuck in 1979 and 1980.
Mhm. Okay, we will take one last question. For those cultural organizations exploring the history of LGBTQ communities around the country, how do you communicate with each other?
Yeah, that would be a great opportunity, I would say. I think the newness, the relative newness of the field, if you will, of if we think about uh, that reference to 2016 as the as a kind of watershed moment in celebrating and acknowledging LGBTQ history at the Stonewall Inn and other developments that followed from that. That's the recent past, right? There's not much time that's passed, but I think there is an opportunity to build networks and to share more information. I've had a chance to travel to. I mentioned Dr. Retzloff, who teaches at Michigan State University. I've had a chance to visit the library there and the Clark Library at CMU. The Gerber Hart Library and Archives in Chicago is actually extends back into, I think, the 1980s is when they first began collecting. Um, Fantastic, phenomenal collection and institution that likely holds all kinds of information about Michigan and Saugatuck in particular because of that close connection to Chicago. But um, more work to be done. Yeah, I think to build those relationships. Great idea.
Well, yeah, I think that's all our question. And thank you so much for a great and informative presentation. And just a reminder to everybody, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording when it's available in the next few days. And now I would like to quickly announce our next webinar, which is being scheduled on May 23rd at 1 o'clock. And it's an update on the grant programs of the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. Um, they are our webinar sponsor, so it's great to learn more about the updates of their programs. And thank you, Eric, again for your time giving us this presentation. And thank you, everybody, for participating, and hope to see you all next time.